3 weeks. That's how long Jake had been stuck in this hospital bed, staring at the same white ceiling tiles and counting the same water stains. The motorcycle crash had messed up his leg pretty bad, and the doctors said he needed to stay put until everything healed properly. At first, he thought he'd go crazy from boredom, but then he started getting to know the people who worked there, and that made things a lot more interesting. The day shift nurses were like a family. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who always brought him extra pudding from the cafeteria and told stories about her grandkids. Then there was Tommy, the male nurse who cracked jokes while changing bandages and made even the most uncomfortable procedures bearable. The evening crew was just as friendly. They'd chat about sports, ask about his job as a mechanic, and generally made him feel like he was hanging out with friends, rather than being stuck in a medical facility. But everything changed when the night shift started. The first time he saw her, Jake thought maybe he was having some kind of medication-induced dream. She walked into his room at exactly 10 o'clock, moving like she was gliding across the floor. Her hair was so blonde it was almost white, pulled back in a perfect bun that probably took her 2 seconds to do, but looked like it came from a magazine. Her eyes were this incredible shade of blue that reminded him of ice, and when she looked at him, it felt like she was looking right through him. "Good evening," she said in this accent he couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe? "I'm your night nurse. Time for vitals." That was it. No introduction, no small talk, no asking how he was feeling. She just got to work with these precise, almost robotic movements. Blood pressure cuff on, pump, 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 off, thermometer under his tongue. Wait, note the reading. Check his leg brace, adjust something, make a note on her clipboard. The whole process took maybe 4 minutes, and she didn't say another word, except good night before leaving. Jake lay there afterward wondering if that had actually happened or if his pain medication was stronger than he thought. The next night, same thing. 10 o'clock exactly. She appeared in his doorway like she materialized out of thin air, did her routine, and vanished. This time he tried to make conversation. "Hey, I didn't catch your name yesterday," he said as she was checking his foreline. "Nurse Petrov," she replied without looking up. "That's a cool name. Where are you from?" "Europe." "Which part of Europe?" "Eastern." "Okay then." Jake got the message that she wasn't exactly the chatty type. By the 4th night, he'd started looking forward to her visits, even though they were about as warm as a winter morning. There was something fascinating about how different she was from everyone else. While the other nurses would linger to chat or ask if he needed anything extra, she followed her routine like she was following a computer program. But it wasn't sloppy or careless. Actually, it was the opposite. She was incredibly thorough and gentle, even though she barely spoke. He started paying attention to little details. During her brief visits, she wore the small silver pendant that caught the hallway light when she moved. Her scrubs were always perfectly pressed, unlike everyone else's wrinkled ones after a long shift. She never ate in the staff break room with the other nurses. He knew this because his room was right across from it, and he could see through the glass walls. During her breaks, she'd disappear somewhere else entirely. One night, Jake heard 2 of the day shift nurses talking in the hallway as they were getting ready to leave. Their voices carried through his open door. "I still can't figure her out," one was saying. "She's been here almost 2 years, and I don't know anything about her, except her last name." "My cousin works in HR," the other nurse whispered back. "She told me the girl came here alone from some country over there. Sends most of her paycheck back home to family. Apparently she works more hours than anybody else. Makes sense why she's so serious all the time then. Probably has a lot on her shoulders. Still, you'd think she'd warm up a little after all this time. Sometimes I wonder if she's even human." They both laughed at that, but Jake didn't find it funny. Something about the way they talked about her bothered him. Sure, she was different, but that didn't make her an alien or a robot. Maybe she had good reasons for keeping to herself. That night, when she came in at her usual time, Jake found himself studying her face more carefully behind those ice blue eyes. He thought he saw something else, tiredness, maybe, or sadness. It was hard to tell because she was so good at keeping her expression neutral. But for just a second, when she thought he wasn't looking, her shoulders seemed to sag a little, like she was carrying something heavy. "Long day?" he asked quietly. She paused for half a second with her hand on his blood pressure cuff, then continued. With her routine, "Every day is long," she said, so softly he almost didn't hear it. It wasn't much, but it was the first real thing she'd said to him that wasn't about his medical care. Jake decided right then that there was definitely a real person under all that professional armor. He just had to figure out how to find her. After that tiny breakthrough moment, Jake became completely fascinated with figuring out Nurse Petrov. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. He started looking forward to 10 o'clock every night, not just because it broke up the endless boredom of hospital life, but because he was determined to learn something new about this mystery woman. The next evening, he positioned himself so he could watch her approach his room through the hallway window. She walked with this steady, measured pace, like she was counting steps in her head. Her white sneakers barely made a sound on the linoleum floor. Jake noticed she carried her clipboard the exact same way every night, held against her chest with both hands. Everything about her seemed planned and controlled. When she entered his room, Jake was ready with a different approach. "That's a beautiful pendant you're wearing," he said as she reached for his wrist to check his pulse. Her hand froze for just a moment. She glanced down at the small silver piece hanging from her neck, then back at him. For the first time since he met her, she looked genuinely surprised that someone had noticed something personal about her. "Thank you," she said quietly, then continued with checking his pulse. But Jake caught something in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Softness. Is it from your family back home?" He pressed gently. This time she did look directly at him, studying his face like she was trying to figure out if he was genuinely curious or just making small talk. After a long moment, she nodded once. "From my grandmother," she said. "Before she passed, it wasn't much, but it was something real, something personal." Jake felt like he'd just discovered a crack in a wall he'd been trying to climb for weeks. Over the next few nights, he began paying even closer attention to everything about her routine. He noticed that she always checked his leg brace more carefully than the other nurses did, making tiny adjustments that actually made him more comfortable. Her hands, despite being all business, were incredibly gentle. She never once caused him pain during any of her procedures, unlike some of the day shift staff who were friendlier but sometimes rushed through things. He also started timing her breaks, while the other nurses would gather in the break room, laughing and sharing snacks. She would disappear down the hallway toward the stairs. One night, his curiosity got the better of him. During her break time, he carefully maneuvered his wheelchair to the window that faced the parking lot. Sure enough, there she was, sitting alone on a bench outside, talking on her phone in what sounded like a completely different language, even from 5 floors up. He could see that her whole body language was different during that phone call. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands moved as she talked, and at one point, she even laughed. It was the first time he'd seen her show any real emotion, and it made him realize just how much effort it must take for her to maintain that professional mask all the time. The breakthrough came during his 3rd week, on a particularly busy night when the hospital seemed to be in chaos. There had been some kind of accident, and extra patients were being brought in. Jake could hear the commotion in the hallways, nurses running back and forth, doctors being called over the intercom. Nurse Petrov was almost an hour late for her usual 10 o'clock rounds. When she finally appeared in his doorway, Jake could see the stress in her face, even though she was trying to hide it. Her perfect bun had a few strands of hair falling loose, and there were small wrinkles in her scrubs. "Sorry for delay," she said, moving quickly toward his bedside. "Very busy tonight, hey?" "No worries," Jake said. "Sounds like you guys are dealing with a lot out there. Are you okay?" She paused in the middle of unwrapping the blood pressure cuff and looked at him with surprise. Again, it was like no one had asked her that question in a very long time. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice wavered just slightly. "You know, you don't have to be fine all the time," Jake said gently. It's okay to have tough days. Something shifted in her expression. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw exhaustion and maybe even sadness in those ice blue eyes. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. Sometimes, she said very quietly, it is hard to see people hurt and not be able to fix everything. It was the most personal thing she'd ever said to him, and Jake felt honored that she'd shared even that small piece of herself. He could see how much she cared about her patients, even though she kept that caring hidden behind walls of professional distance. You do more than you know, he told her sincerely. You take better care of me than anyone else here, even if you don't say much while you're doing it. She looked at him for a long moment, and Jake thought he saw the beginning of a real smile, before she caught herself and went back to checking his vitals. But something had definitely changed between them that night. The ice was starting to thaw. The 4th week in the hospital was when everything started falling apart for Jake. At least mentally, his body was healing fine, but his mind was struggling with something he hadn't expected. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in, and it wasn't pretty. During the day, he could distract himself with visitors, physical therapy, and the constant chatter of the friendly day shift staff. But at night, when the hospital got quiet and he was left alone with his thoughts, the darkness crept in. He lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things that might never be the same. The doctors had been honest with him from the beginning. His leg would heal, they said, but there might be complications. He might walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He might not be able to go back to his job as a mechanic, which required him to be on his feet all day and crawl around under cars. His whole future felt uncertain, and that scared him more than the physical pain ever had. This particular night was the worst yet. He'd been lying awake since 8 o'clock, his mind racing with worry about what would happen when he finally got discharged. How would he pay his bills if he couldn't work? Would his girlfriend stick around if he ended up disabled? What if he never felt normal again? By the time 10 o'clock rolled around, Jake was in a pretty dark place emotionally. He was staring out the window at the parking lot lights, trying not to think about how different his life might be in a few months. When he heard the soft footsteps he groaned to recognize. Nurse Petrov entered the room with her usual quiet efficiency, but this time something was different. Instead of immediately going to work on his vitals, she stopped and looked at him carefully. You are not sleeping, she observed. It wasn't a question. Nah, not really, Jake said, trying to keep his voice normal. Just thinking about stuff. She moved closer to his bedside, and Jake realized she was studying his face with the same careful attention she usually reserved for checking his medical equipment. You have been crying, she said matter-of-factly. Jake felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He hadn't even realized there were tears on his face. I'm fine, he said quickly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But instead of just getting on with her routine like she usually did, Nurse Petrov did something completely unexpected. She set down her clipboard and pulled the visitor's chair closer to his bed. Then she sat down. Jake stared at her in shock. In all the weeks he'd been there, she had never, ever deviated from her routine. She checked his vitals, made her notes, and left. That was it. But here she was, sitting beside his bed like she actually had time to spare. What is troubling you? She asked in her careful, accented English. The question caught Jake completely off guard. He'd gotten so used to her professional distance that having her actually ask about his feelings felt surreal. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. It's stupid, he started, then stopped himself. Something about the way she was looking at him, patient and genuinely concerned, made him want to be honest. I'm scared, he admitted, about what happens when I leave here. Whether I'll ever be normal again. She nodded slowly, like this made perfect sense to her. I understand being afraid of unknown future, she said. It is normal to feel this way. Yeah, but you probably think I'm being a baby about it, Jake said, feeling embarrassed again. I mean, I'm alive, right? That's what matters. No, she said firmly, and her voice had a strength in it that surprised him. Fear is not weakness. Recovery is not just about body healing, Mine must heal too. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Understanding. Like she knew exactly what he was going through. Not just as a nurse who'd seen other patients struggle, but as someone who had faced her own fears about an uncertain future. You sound like you know what that's like, he said quietly. She was quiet for a long moment, and Jake thought maybe he'd pushed too far. But then she spoke, and her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. When I came to America, I was very afraid, she said. Everything was different. Language, people, customs. I did not know if I would succeed or fail. Every day was uncertainty. Jake felt something shift inside his chest. This was the most personal thing she'd ever shared with him, and it made him realize that behind all that professional armor was someone who really did understand what it felt like to be scared and alone. What helped you get through it? He asked. She considered this for a moment, absently touching the silver pendant at her necktie. She said finally, and remembering that being strong does not mean not being afraid. It means doing what you must do even when you are afraid. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Jake found that just having someone acknowledge his fears instead of brushing them off with empty reassurances made him feel better than he had in days. You know, he said eventually, you're not what I expected when I first met you. What did you expect? She asked, and Jake thought he detected just the hint of curiosity in her voice. Honestly, I thought you were kind of cold, like you didn't care about your patients as people. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes it is easier to care from distance, less hurt when things go wrong. But that's not who you really are, is it? Jake asked gently. She met his eyes then, and for the first time since he'd known her, her expression was completely unguarded. He saw kindness there, and sadness, and a warmth that she usually kept hidden. No, she said quietly, it is not. Before she left that night, she did something that completely changed everything between them. She reached over and gently squeezed his hand. You are stronger than you know, Jake, she said, and you will find your way. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and the first time she'd touched him for any reason other than medical necessity. That simple gesture, and the warmth in her voice when she said it, meant more to Jake than all the cheerful encouragement he'd gotten from everyone else combined. As she gathered her clipboard and headed for the door, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, not because his situation had changed, but because someone had seen his fear and hadn't tried to fix it or dismiss it. She just sat with him in it, and that made all the difference. The night after Nurse Petrov had sat with Jake during his breakdown, everything felt different. He'd spent the whole day thinking about their conversation, replaying every word she'd said. For the first time since his accident, he felt like someone really understood what he was going through. Not just the physical recovery part, but the fear and uncertainty that came with having your whole life turned upside down. But now he had a new problem. He wanted to show her how much that moment had meant to him, but he had no idea how. What do you do when someone saves you from drowning in your own thoughts? Especially when that person has spent weeks keeping everyone at arm's length. Jake wasn't the type of guy who was good with words. Back home, if he wanted to thank someone, he'd fix their car for free or buy them a beer. But he was stuck in a hospital bed, and Nurse Petrov didn't seem like the beer-drinking type anyway. He needed to find a way to let her know that her kindness had made a real difference. Something that would break through her professional walls without making her uncomfortable. All day long, he watched the other nurses interact with patients and families. Mrs. Rodriguez got hugs from grateful relatives. Tommy got high fives from the kids he treated. The evening shift nurses got thank you cards and flowers. But Jake had never seen anyone try to connect with Nurse Petrov on a personal level. She seemed to exist in this bubble where everything was strictly professional. Maybe that was exactly the problem. Maybe no one had ever tried to show her appreciation in a way that acknowledged she was a real person, not just a medical professional doing her job. As 10 o'clock approached, Jake felt nervous in a way he hadn't since high school. He'd come up with an idea, but he wasn't sure if it was brilliant or completely stupid. What if she thought he was being inappropriate? What if it made her retreat back into her shell and ruin the small progress they made? But then he remembered the look in her eyes the night before when she'd squeezed his hand. There had been something there, something real and warm that she usually kept hidden. Maybe it was worth the risk. When she appeared in his doorway at exactly 10 o'clock, Jake felt his heart start beating faster. She looked the same as always, perfect posture, clipboard held against her chest. That careful professional expression. But now he knew there was so much more underneath that surface. "Good evening, Jake," she said, and he noticed she was still using his first name instead of calling him Patient or Mr. Thompson, like she used to. "Hey there," he said, trying to sound casual even though his mouth felt dry. She moved to his bedside and began her usual routine, but Jake could tell something was different. She seemed more relaxed somehow, like some invisible tension had left her shoulders. When she checked his pulse, her touch lingered just a second longer than necessary. "How are you feeling tonight?" she asked, and Jake could hear genuine concern in her voice. "Much better, actually," he said. "Thanks to you." She paused in the middle of adjusting his IV line and looked at him questioningly. "Last night." Jake explained what you did for me, sitting with me, talking to me like a real person instead of just another patient. It meant everything. I don't think you realize how much." A soft blush crept across her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," Jake said firmly. "That's not true. You went way beyond what anyone would do. You saw that I was struggling and you took the time to actually help, even though it wasn't part of your job." She finished with his four and started checking his leg brace. But Jake could see that his words had affected her. Her movements were gentler than usual, more careful. "I wanted to thank you properly," Jake continued, "but I couldn't figure out how. I mean, what do you give someone who's already given you exactly what you needed?" She looked up at him then, curiosity replacing the usual guardedness in her expression. Jake took a deep breath. This was it. Either his idea would work, or he was about to make things really awkward between them. "I know this might seem weird," he said, "but where I come from, when someone does something really special for you, there's this tradition." He paused, suddenly feeling foolish. What if she didn't understand? What if she thought he was making fun of her? But then he looked at her face and saw something that gave him courage. She was waiting, actually interested in what he had to say. Her ice blue eyes were focused completely on him, and for once, she didn't seem to be thinking about her medical duties or her schedule or anything else. "Except this moment. Where I'm from," Jake said, his voice softer now. "When someone shows you real kindness, you give them something from the heart." Before he could lose his nerve, Jake looked directly into her eyes, smiled the most genuine smile he'd felt in weeks, and gently blew her a kiss across the room. It wasn't romantic or inappropriate. It was more like the kind of gesture you'd give to a favorite aunt or a dear friend. A way of saying thank you for seeing me and you matter to me all at once. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Nurse Petrov froze completely, her clipboard halfway to her chest. Her eyes went wide, and a deep red blush spread across her entire face. For a moment, she looked almost panicked, like she didn't know how to process what had just happened. Jake held his breath, suddenly terrified that he completely misjudged the situation. What if she reported him for inappropriate behavior? What if she requested to be assigned to different patients? What if he'd ruined everything? But then something amazing happened. The panic in her eyes faded, replaced by something Jake had never seen before: wonder. Like someone had just handed her a gift she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. And then she smiled. Not the polite, professional smile she used with patients. Not the careful expression she wore like armor. This was a real smile, one that started in her eyes and spread across her whole face, transforming her from the ice queen everyone thought she was into someone warm and genuinely beautiful. She shook her head slightly, and Jake caught something in her expression that looked almost like amusement. "You are trouble, Jake," she whispered, but her tone was playful, not disapproving. She finished her rounds with a lightness in her step that Jake had never seen before. When she wrote notes on his chart, There was almost a bounce to her movements. And when she said good night, there was warmth in her voice that made Jake feel like he'd just discovered fire after she left. Jake lay in his bed grinning like an idiot. He'd done it. He found a way to thank her that had gotten through all her defenses and shown her that someone appreciated not just her professional skills, but her as a person. More importantly, he'd seen behind her mask, and what he'd found, there was even better than he'd hoped. Nurse Petrov wasn't cold or distant or alien at all. She was just someone who learned to protect herself by hiding her true nature from the world. But now Jake had seen the real her, and something told him that things between them would never be the same again. The week after Jake blew that kiss to Nurse Petrov was like watching someone slowly come back to life. It started small, tiny changes that probably no one else would have noticed. But Jake had been studying her for weeks, so he caught every single shift in her behavior. The first thing he noticed was how she entered his room. Before, she moved like she was on a military mission, all business and efficiency. Now there was something softer in the way she walked. She still arrived at exactly 10 o'clock every night, still carried her clipboard the same way. But there was a gentleness to her movements that hadn't been there before. On the second night after their breakthrough moment, she actually lingered. After finishing his vitals, not for long, maybe an extra minute or two, but she stood by his bedside and asked how his physical therapy had gone that day. It was the first time she'd ever asked about something that wasn't directly related to her medical duties. Getting stronger every day, Jake told her, should be out of here soon. Something flickered across her face when he said that. It was so quick he almost missed it, but it looked like disappointment. Like maybe she didn't want him to leave as much as she should have. That is good, she said, but her voice sounded strange, almost sad. By the third night, Jake realized she was arriving a few minutes early to his room. Not obviously early, she was too professional for that. But instead of showing up at exactly 10 o'clock, she'd appear at 9:57 or 9:58. Those few extra minutes might not seem like much, but for someone who had followed her routine like clockwork for months, it was huge. During those stolen minutes before her official rounds began, she'd ask him questions, real questions, not medical ones. How long had he been a mechanic? Did he have family nearby? What was his favorite thing about his job? She listened to his answers with genuine interest, and Jake found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his day. The biggest change came during his 5th week in the hospital. Jake had been having trouble sleeping. Again, not because of depression this time, but because he was nervous about going home. The doctors had told him he'd be discharged in a few days. And while he was excited about getting his life back, he was also worried about leaving behind the one person who had really understood what he was going through. That night, Nurse Petrov found him wide awake, staring at the ceiling. "Cannot sleep again?" she asked, setting down her clipboard. "Just thinking," Jake said, "about going home." She pulled the visitor's chair closer to his bed, just like she had the night she'd sat with him during his breakdown. But this time, instead of looking concerned, she looked curious. "Are you still afraid?" she asked. "Not afraid exactly," Jake said. "More like, I don't know. Sad, I guess." "Sad to leave hospital?" she asked, sounding surprised. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. How could he explain that he was sad about leaving her without making it sound weird or inappropriate? "It's going to be strange not seeing the people who helped me get better," he said carefully, "especially the ones who went above and beyond their job descriptions." She looked down at her hands, and Jake saw that familiar blush creeping across her cheeks. "You helped me too, you know," she said quietly. "I did." "How?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Jake thought maybe she wasn't going to answer. But then she looked up at him, and her eyes were softer than he'd ever seen them. "You reminded me that it is okay to care about people," she said. "For a long time, I thought caring too much would make jobs difficult, but you showed me that caring is what makes job meaningful." Jake felt something warm spread through his chest. "You were always caring. You just kept it hidden." "Yes," she said with a small smile. hidden from everyone, including myself sometimes, over the next 2 nights. Their conversations got longer and more personal. She told him about her family back in Moldova, her parents who ran a small farm, her younger sister who was studying to become a teacher, her grandmother who had raised her after her parents couldn't afford to care for all their children. "The pendant you wear," Jake said one night, "your grandmother gave it to you?" She touched the silver piece at her neck. "Day I left for America. She said it would keep me safe and remind me I am loved even when I am far from home." Smart lady. Very smart. She told me something else too. She paused, looking uncertain. "What?" She said that in America, I should not be afraid to let people see real me. She said hiding behind walls might keep me safe, but it would also keep me lonely. Jake felt his heart do something funny in his chest. "Sounds like she knew you pretty well." She did, and she was right about being lonely. She met his eyes, until now. On his last night in the hospital, Nurse Petrov arrived at her usual time. But something was different about her. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her clipboard in a way he'd never seen before. "So tomorrow you go home," she said as she checked his vitals one last time. "Yeah, weird, right? After 5 weeks of this being my whole world." She finished with his blood pressure cuff and set it aside. But instead of moving on to the next part of her routine, she just stood there, looking like she was trying to work up the courage to say something. "Jake," she said finally, and her voice was softer than usual. "Yeah?" She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. Her hands were actually shaking a little as she held it out to him. "What's this?" he asked, taking the paper. "My phone number," she said, her cheeks turning bright red. In case you need anything during recovery." Jake looked at the carefully written numbers on the paper, then back at her face. She looked terrified and hopeful at the same time, like she'd just taken the biggest risk of her life. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "I mean, is this allowed?" "Probably not," she admitted. "But I do not care about rules right now. I care about not losing friend I just found." Friend. The word hit Jake in a way he hadn't expected. This amazing, complicated, beautiful person considered him a friend. Someone she'd been willing to break her own rules for. "I'd like that," he said. "Being friends with you. I mean, you're pretty amazing. You know that." She looked down, smiling that real smile he'd grown to love. "You were first person to make me feel like real person instead of just nurse in very long time." "Well, you are definitely a real person," Jake said, "and a pretty wonderful one." As she gathered her things to leave for the last time, Jake realized something had happened over these past weeks that he hadn't expected. This woman who everyone thought was cold and distant had turned out to be one of the most genuine, caring people he'd ever met. She'd helped him heal in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. And somehow, he'd helped her remember parts of herself she'd forgotten. The alien nurse who had seemed so unreachable had become beautifully, perfectly human. And it had all started with one patient who refused to accept that keeping distance was the only way to connect with another person. Sometimes the best friendships begin in the most unexpected places. With the most unlikely people, all it takes is someone willing to look past the walls we build around ourselves and see the person hiding underneath.